are happy that PMOI members at Ashraf 3 are joining us today in this conference. We welcome them. We welcome them. سلام و درود به مجاهدین در اشراف 3. ما بسیار خوشحالیم که در این لحظات شما با ما هستین. ما همه شما رو میبینیم. درود بر همه شما، تک تک شما. Dignitaries, distinguished guests, I'm very pleased to see you. Your presence at the home of the Iranian Resistance sends a powerful message of solidarity to millions of Iranians who seek the overthrow of the religious dictatorship. The regime's leader, in one of his recent speech, threatened the people of Iran, saying that if they create unrest, they will be crushed. This is an admission by Khamenei that Iranian society is ready to rise and overthrow the mullah's regime. 3 key factors have shaped this situation. First, severe oppression, economic bankruptcy, deep social crisis, and widespread government corruption have brought society to the brink of explosion. The 90% boycott of the 2 elections in 2024 demonstrated that the regime lacks any social base in Iran. The second factor is the regime's defeats in the region, including Hezbollah suffering a crushing blow and the overthrow of Syria's dictatorship, the regime's most important ally. And third, the expansion of the organized resistance, which is preparing for an uprising and the overthrow of the regime. Allow me to share a few points regarding recent developments. First, the religious dictatorship had extended its influence through Syria and Iraq to the Mediterranean Sea and Lebanon. With this strategy, Khamenei created a protective shield for the regime and a tool for blackmail. Second, for many years, Khamenei balanced the regime's internal weaknesses by relying on Hezbollah and Syria as a show of power in the region. Third, it is often wrongly said that the Syrian army collapsed in 11 days. In reality, this army had disintegrated many years ago. According to IRGC officials, even back then, Bashar Assad had no hope of remaining in power. Indeed, it was Khamenei who ordered the IRGC and Hezbollah to use brutal force to keep him in power. But this time was different. Neither Hezbollah nor the IRGC could tolerate the pressure. They chose to escape rather than fight. Fourth, the fall of the Syrian dictatorship and the closing of land and air corridors used to support the regime's forces in Lebanon have significantly reduced its capacity for warmongering and terrorism in the region. And fifth, today, the balance of power in the region has shifted against the regime. The foundation of the mullahs' blackmail diplomacy on the international stage and their efforts to preserve the policy of appeasement have largely reduced. Before, the regime and its lobbyists promoted its strength and stability. Today, such claims have been entirely proven false. Sixth, most important is the impact of this event inside Iran. With the fall of Bashar Assad, everyone witnessed the collapse of the regime's forces in Syria. They saw how weak and fragile is the IRGC. Khamenei's efforts to suppress the uprising by starting a war in the Middle East on October 7, 2023 have completely failed. This event has sparked new energy for the uprisings inside Iran. Iranian society is increasingly angry over the spending of tens of billions of dollars on its assets by the Iranian regime to maintain the Syrian dictatorship. The regime's suppressive institutions are deeply terrified. They have ordered security forces to prevent protests and have intensified repression and executions. In 2024, the regime broke its own record of brutality by carrying out at least 1,000 executions. 2 weeks after the fall of the Syrian dictatorship, the regime's Chief Justice ordered the Prosecutor General and prosecutors nationwide to collaborate directly with intelligence, security, and law enforcement agencies and take all necessary measures to neutralize the enemy's plot to create unrest within the country. This is a reaction to the Iranian people's determination to end the mullahs regime that its end is certainly near. Distinguished guests, dear friends, with the fall of the Syrian dictatorship, now our people see more clearly than ever that the overthrow of the Velayat-e-Faqih regime is possible and within reach. They trust in their own power and in the courage of the resistance units to bring down the regime. The resistance units in Tehran and other cities are advancing the great task of preparing for an organized uprising. Young men and women are increasingly joining the units and are supported by the people. In this way, our society is progressing towards the formation of the great army of freedom. Khamenei and his IRGC were unable to maintain the Syrian dictatorship, and they certainly cannot preserve the regime in the face of organized resistance and uprising, and the regime will be overthrown. Khamenei compares his IRGC and Basij forces to commit crimes against the Iranian people by providing them money and material resources. But they are terrified when confronted by an organized resistance and the people's uprising. The anger of the Iranian people has entered a new phase. Extreme poverty, low wages, 40% inflation, rising prices, and lack of water and electricity have pushed everyone to the edge. The clerical regime is at impasse in every way. Therefore, it is trying to convince Western governments to continue their policy of appeasement. Unfortunately, over the past 3 decades, at the time the regime was on the brink, Western governments sided with the regime. One example was during the 2009 uprisings, and another was during the 2022 uprisings. It later became clear that during those times, US envoys were negotiating with the regime. Another significant example happened in 2003 when the United States consolidated the weapons of National Liberation Army of Iran. It was a move that was welcomed by the mullahs regime. This led to the expansion of fundamentalism and warmongering in the region under Tehran's direction. It also encouraged the mullahs to pursue their nuclear weapons program. Today, another decisive moment in the history of Iran has arrived. The Iranian people are prepared to overthrow the regime. During a meeting at the US Senate, the overthrow of this regime is within reach, and the Iranian resistance has all the requirements to transfer power to the people when the regime is overthrown. Now an explosive society and protest movements with resistance units at their core are preparing for an uprising. There exists an organized resistance with the People's Mujahedin Organization of Iran, PMOI, and its thousands of experienced members at the heart of this movement, and Ashraf 3 is one of its centers. There is also a democratic alternative, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, the most long-lasting political coalition in Iran's history, which clearly distinguishes itself from both the monarchy and the mullahs. This resistance has a clear program for tomorrow's free Iran. It advocates for freedom and women's rights, autonomy for Iran's nationalities, equality between Shia and Sunni Muslims, as well as other religions, the separation of religion and the state, the abolition of the death penalty, and a non-nuclear Iran that will always defend peace in the Middle East. According to the NCRI's program, after the overthrow of the regime, a transitional government will be formed for a maximum of 6 months. Its main responsibility will be to hold free elections for a constituent assembly and transfer power to the people's representatives. It is time for Western governments to avoid past policies and stand with the Iranian people this time. We call on them to recognize the Iranian people's struggle for the overthrow of the regime and the battle of the rebellious youth against the Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. I must emphasize that the recognition of the Iranian resistance and resistance units' struggle is a necessary part of a firm policy against the Mullah's regime. The overthrow of the Mullah's regime is the only way to establish freedom in Iran and peace and tranquility in the region. Thank you all very much. If you allow me, I want to have a few words in Persian for the Iranian people inside Iran, because they have this conference. هموطنان عزیز، دوستان گرامی، خواهران و برادرانم در اشرف 3، بیش از 1 ماهه که حکومت خامنه‌ای از سقوط دیکتاتوری بشار اسد به خودش می‌لرزه. همونطور که خودش بارها پیش‌بینی کرده بود، از این به بعد باید در تهران، اصفهان، شیراز، همدان، کرمانشاه و سایر شهرها در برابر قیام کنندگان و شورشگران خط ببندد. و همچنان که قوای 100,000 نفری خامنه‌ای در سوریه از هم پاشید، در شهرهای ایران هم سپاه پاسدارانش در برابر قیام‌ها و ارتش بزرگ آزادی مردم ایران دوام نخواهد آورد. در جریان سقوط دیکتاتوری دمشق، جهان شاهد تغییرات بنیادی تعادل قوا در خاورمیانه به زیان رژیم آخوندهاست. مردم ما فراتر از آن دکل سرنگونی این رژیم را به چشم می‌بینند. ترس و لرز پاسداران و بسیجی‌های وحشت زده که سخنرانی‌های پی در پی خامنه‌ای آرامشان نمی‌کند، گویای همه چیز است. قطعاً امروز با حضور شما نمایندگان و شخصیت‌های بین‌المللی از آمریکا و اروپا و همه شما اشرف نشان‌ها و حمایت شما از مردم و مقاومت ایران، این ترس و لرز 100 چندان می‌شود و خامنه‌ای با یک جنون افسار گسیخته مجدداً به صحنه خواهد آمد. اما خامنه‌ای که در کشتار 500,000 نفر از مردم بیگناه سوریه در 13 سال گذشته بیشترین مسئولیت را دارد، به خاطر این جنایت بزرگ و همه خونهایی که از پیکر مردم ایران و سایر کشورهای منطقه ریخته، در پیشگاه خلقهای منطقه و مردم ایران مورد حسابرسی قرار خواهد گرفت. او امروز شمار اعدام زندانیان بیگناه را به حدی افزایش داده که در این دوران حکومت او یکی از بی‌سابقه ترین هاست. این کندن گور رژیم به دست خود خامنه‌ای است. اون نمیخواد از سرنگونی شاه و سرنگونی بشار اسد درس بگیره، اما قیام کنندگان و شورشگران درس فراموشی ناپذیری رو به او خواهند داد. پیش به سوی جمهوری دموکراتیک، مقصد قیام‌های سازمان یافته با پیشتازی کانون‌های شورشی و ارتش بزرگ آزادی مردم ایران. سلام بر آزادی، درود بر همه شما.
Thank you very much indeed to Mrs. Maryam Rajavi for your, as ever, most insightful and powerful remarks. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to you at this important and most timely gathering on Iran. Allow me also to bid a very warm welcome to the residents of Ashraf 3, who, as you know, join us remotely this afternoon. Allow me to extend our heartfelt gratitude to them for joining us. We're most grateful. By way of a very short introduction, my name is Azadeh Zabeti, and I have the profound personal pleasure and great privilege to be your host and master of ceremony throughout this afternoon's gathering. This conference, ladies and gentlemen, will address one of the most pressing and challenging issues of our time at the moment, and that is, of course, the destructive threats of the Iranian regime to world peace, stability, and security, and, of course, the prospects for democratic change in Iran. Iran's role in destabilizing the Middle East through its meddling and sponsorship of terrorism and its support for proxy groups are well-proven facts, and it can no longer be ignored by the international community. Its destructive arms, as you know, have now reached our soils in Europe, namely, of course, in the Ukraine. Simultaneously, the regime's brutal suppression of her own people, evidenced very much by the soaring rate in executions, as well as the crackdown on dissent of the Iranian people, very much underscore the urgency of fostering meaningful change for Iran and her people. In light of the shifting dynamics in the region, in the Middle East, of course, including the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, a key ally of Tehran, as you all know, the prospects for regime change in Iran are ever looming. And with that in mind, we should be focused on strategies that prioritize the aspirations of the Iranian people for freedom and for democracy, while at the same time advancing regional peace and stability. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker who will address this gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very much my great honor to introduce to you General James Jones, the former National Security Advisor and distinguished four-star general, with decades of leadership in global security and strategy. General Jones's insights into Iran's regional influence, terrorism, and prospects for policy-driven change will provide invaluable context for us at this afternoon's conference. Ladies and gentlemen, please do join me in giving a very warm welcome to General Janša.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Rajavi, Excellencies, friends of NCRI and MEK, our friends in Ashraf 3, ladies and gentlemen. It would be an understatement not to recognize that today we stand at a pivotal moment in history, a moment where the fate of Iran and its people, the stability of an entire region in the Middle East, and the values of freedom and justice hang in the balance. It is, in fact, a serious battle between autocracies and democracies, the outcome of which will have a profound effect on how we will live, and more importantly, perhaps, how our children and grandchildren will live. But the year 2024 has been nothing short of catastrophic for the Iranian regime. Its foundations, both regionally and domestically, are crumbling under the weight of its own failures, despite their allies in Russia, China, and North Korea. So let us start with the regime's regional strategy, a strategy that has been built on proxies, terrorist networks, and the blood of innocent people for many, many years. And for years, Syria was a linchpin of the regime's expansionist ambitions, its so-called strategic depth. It is estimated that the regime spent more than $50 billion propping up the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It lost, by some estimates, 15,000 Revolutionary Guards, including more than 36 brigadier generals. I'm very sensitive to generals being killed, as you might imagine. But this year, the fall of Bashar al-Assad delivered a crushing blow to that strategy. At the same time, Hezbollah, once Tehran's most powerful proxy, is on the verge of collapse. And that deserves a round of applause. The Houthis in Yemen have suffered devastating setbacks. The regime's web of influence, meticulously woven over decades and at a huge cost, is unraveling before our eyes. But the collapse isn't limited to the region. It's tearing through Iran itself. The economic freefall of Iran is clear. The Iranian economy is in ruins. The national currency, the rial, has plummeted to an unprecedented 810,000 riyals per US dollar, its lowest point since 1979. Prices are spiraling out of control, corruption is rampant, essential goods are out of reach for most Iranians, and severe power shortages and energy shortages have gripped the nation amid a harsh winter condition. However, the economic collapse is only one side of the story. Across the country, people have risen up in defiance. Protests have erupted in nearly every corner of society. Bazaar merchants in Tehran and other cities, retirees demanding their pensions, communications workers, nurses, doctors, and educators, and others important for the society to run adequately. And now the regime has responded, but how has it responded? With unspeakable brutality. This year alone, close to 1,000 people have already been executed. the highest number in over 3 decades. 34 of these executions were women, and 119 belonged to the Baluchi minority. Shockingly, 695 of those executions, nearly 70%, occurred under the so-called moderate president, Masoud Pezeshkian's tenure. But here's what the regime doesn't understand. Repression cannot extinguish the flames of resistance. In fact, it encourages all of us to even be more resolute in the downfall of the regime. Amid this brutal crackdown, MEK-affiliated resistance units have risen across Iran. They have defied the regime's pervasive surveillance, infiltrated its security layers, and boldly targeted regime symbols, IRGC bases, and paramilitary bases and centers. These brave men and women remind us of one undeniable truth: the spirit of resistance in Iran is alive, it cannot be crushed, and it cannot be silenced. Today, the Iranian regime is at its weakest point since 1979. The death knells have begun to toll for this oppressive theocracy. But in every moment of crisis lies an opportunity for change, and that change comes in the form of a viable democratic alternative, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, led by Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. The NCRI's 10-point plan, articulated by Mrs. Rajavi at every instance, offers a clear vision for the future: a free, democratic, secular, and non-nuclear Iran. This vision has received global recognition, with 137 former world leaders, some here today, ambassadors, ministers, and senior officials voicing their enthusiastic support. In November of last year, Mrs. Rajavi addressed the European Parliament, presenting a roadmap for change in Iran and the role of the organized resistance. This roadmap, ladies and gentlemen, isn't just words. It's a blueprint for the future of a nation. At this critical juncture, the international community faces a choice. Will it stand with the Iranian people in their resistance, or will it continue to appease a dying regime? I believe that we all reject appeasement, especially now. We reject the false narrative of no alternative, a narrative that for years the regime and its lobbyists have propagated the lie that there is no alternative to their rule. They claim that the fall of the regime would lead to chaos and dismemberment of Iran. Nothing could be further from the truth. There exists a structured and organized alternative, the NCRI and its principal component, the MEK. We, the West, must reject this false narrative and recognize that the NCRI is the legitimate voice of the Iranian people. We must adopt a clear and firm policy with regard to the regime, and we must fully implement existing sanctions and introduce new targeted sanctions. We must cut off the regime's financial lifelines, particularly by limiting oil exports. We must shut down the regime's terror hubs in Europe. Iranian embassies and diplomatic missions have become terrorist and intelligence hubs. Terror plots on European soil have been directly tied to regime operatives under diplomatic cover. These embassies must be shut down, and all regime agents, including those under false titles, must be exposed and expelled from European soil. And we must engage with the real agents of change. The missing link in Western policy has been the failure to engage with the Iranian people directly and their organized resistance. The true agents of change in Iran are its people. And we must do more to convince the people of Iran that unlike previous periods, 2025 announces itself to be a year of defining moments and activities in history signifying the end of the regime. So the time for action is now. So ladies and gentlemen, the regime in Iran is on borrowed time. Its collapse is no longer a question, it's just a question of when. The Iranian people have spoken for many years. They have endured suffering, tremendous sacrifice, unspeakable repression, and yet they remain unbroken, unyielding, and determined. So it is now up to the international community to also rise to the occasion. Abandon the policy of appeasement. Hold the regime accountable for its crimes. Support the NCRI and Mrs. Rajavi's vision for a free Iran. And begin to articulate what a free democracy in Iran will look like immediately after the collapse. The world must not look away because the time for change is not tomorrow, it's now. In the US right now, as you might imagine, people are saying it's Trump time, a time that will not be good for the regime in Iran, but a time that will be very good for the people of Iran. May 2025 mark a giant step in the fight for freedom for the Iranian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to General Jones. General, your support for the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people and our resistance movement is our great honor. My goodness, ladies and gentlemen, it's not every day that one has the distinct privilege of introducing our next speaker, and as a British Iranian woman, I'm delighted that I have this honor. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is, of course, the Right Honourable Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Foreign Secretary. She is also a very staunch advocate for democracy and global security and stability, and her leadership and insights on confronting authoritarian regimes like Iran's will offer, I'm sure, an invaluable perspective to this afternoon's discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a resoundingly warm welcome to the Right Honourable Liz Truss.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here at what is an absolutely vital time for the world. I believe that 2025 is going to be a critical year in our history. First of all, in only a matter of days' time, President Trump will be back at the helm in the United States, and I believe that will mean a strong United States again, but also a strong free world again. But at the same time, we have an Iran that is seriously weakened by the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, but also because of internal pressure and also because of their failure and the failure of their proxies. This is a real opportunity for change. And what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means a brighter future for the people of Iran without the appalling despotic leadership of this country that we have now. Secondly, it means a more stable Middle East and an end to the existential threat that Israel is under. But for the world, what it means is a weakening of the alliance of authoritarian regimes, the axis of aggression, China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran, that have wrought so much damage and so much fear to the world. And if we think about what the alternative looks like, if we think about what the alternative of not acting in 2025 is, it really is terrible. We know that Iran is on the verge of acquiring a nuclear weapon. We know it is very close. And if Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, it would mean that of all of the 4 states of the axis of authoritarianism had a nuclear weapon. And my fear is that Iran would potentially be the most likely to use a nuclear weapon of those 4 states. That would pose an existential threat to Israel and an existential threat to world peace. We'd also see Iran continue to export their model of terrorism around the world. And we know what it's like now on the streets of Britain because of the malign influence of Iran, the malign influence of Islamism on our streets. We can see the impact of that already, and things will only get worse if we do not act now. But I think it's important to consider how we got into this position in the first place, because it wasn't just the malign activities of the mullahs. It wasn't just the belligerence of China and their threats to Taiwan. It wasn't just the kleptocracy of Russia. It was also because we in the West were weak. We failed to spend enough on our defenses. Instead of taking action against authoritarian regimes, instead of defending freedom of democracy, too many in the West benefited from the cheap oil and the cheap gas, and we did not take action soon enough or early enough. And when we saw the signs that these regimes were threatening not just their own people, but their neighbors and world security, they were appeased rather than taken on. And this is particularly what we have seen in recent years with Iran. When President Joe Biden came into office, he took away maximum pressure on Iran. He made it easier for them to export their oil and their gas. He made it easier for them to ally with China, with Russia, with North Korea, to supply weapons that are now being used in the field in Ukraine, to supply oil and gas that are now being used to build up Iran's military, to build up their proxy forces. And what was said, and I was sitting around the table at the time as Foreign Secretary, what was said was, we need to give Iran another chance to sign the nuclear deal. We need to give them a chance to sign the JCPOA. Now, this was a bad deal in the first place, but it was an even worse deal when Iran almost had a nuclear weapon. and showed absolutely no signs of coming to the table. And it was an even worse deal when the other signatories that we were relying on were Russia and China, the allies of Iran in trying to take down the democratic free world. But too many, and it wasn't just the politicians, it wasn't just President Biden and President Macron, it was also the bureaucrats who didn't want to have a fight, who didn't want to have a row. But what we know through history is if you don't take on an aggressor early, you end up paying more later. And that is the terrible consequence of those failed policies. And I fear the terrible attacks that we saw on Israel on October the 7th were a direct result of failing to do enough early enough in limiting the terrible military aspirations of Iran. What we've seen happen in recent months is that Iran has faced pushback. It has faced pressure. But that pressure has primarily come from Israel rather than the United States of America. Israel has successfully targeted Iran's proxy Hezbollah. The other pressure has come from the people of Iran themselves, and I congratulate Mrs. Rajavi and her movement on what they have done to put pressure internally on the appalling oppressive regime in Iran. We had the uprising in 2022. We had more protests last year. Our screens are full of brave Iranian people standing up against one of the most repressive regimes in the world. And Iran now faces a much more difficult path because of the fall of Assad. They are a weakened regime. And it's vital that we don't just assume that that weakness is going to take its course. We in Europe and America have to do all we can to follow through, to stop Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon, to stop Iran destabilizing the Middle East, and to do all we can to back the people of Iran in their quest for freedom and democracy. Now, of course, we would all love to see the despotic regime of Iran go. But this pressure cannot come from outside. We can support it outside, but it has to come from the people of Iran themselves. And what is important is that the West, Europe, the United States, don't see the regime as inevitable. They don't see the regime as a fact of life. They understand that we should prepare for a world when the regime is no longer there. And we should not fear the end of the regime. We should want the same for the people of Iran that we have in Europe and America, which is freedom and democracy. So what has to happen in order for pressure to be put on the Iranian regime from the outside? And by that, I mean pressure that will stop them acquiring a nuclear weapon. I mean pressure that will stop them with their ambitions to destabilize the Middle East. And I mean pressure that will do all we can to back those who want a free and democratic Iran. Well, first of all, maximum pressure sanctions have to go on Iran. The Iranian economy has to be destabilized. I'm a supporter of the oil and gas industry, of the mantra of drill, baby, drill. And we don't just want to see drilling, in the United States of America, we want to see it in Canada, and we need to see it across Europe. It is time that we stop relying on oil and gas from despotic regimes. And that is the biggest thing that will kill off Iran's economy and enable change to happen in Iran. We need to do what we can to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. And what do I mean by that? First of all, Israel needs to be given full room to maneuver. They need to be given every support and room to maneuver. And if they are not able to do that, if they don't have the capabilities, then the United States will have to step in, because it is of vital strategic importance to the future of the world that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. We also need to take on the forces within our country that do too much to side with Iran and appease Iran. And what am I talking about there? I am talking about some of our media. I'm talking about some of our bureaucracy. I have direct experience of myself of seeing what happens inside the Foreign Office. I've also seen what happens with the American State Department. And we need to take on those who want to appease the regimes who are within our own systems. And I know we have some of our American friends here today. I would like to see the US put pressure on Europe. What do I mean by that? I believe that the UK should prescribe the IRGC. I believe that European countries should be doing more to take on Iranian influence and Islamists within our own countries who are doing so much to destabilize our countries. And I believe more pressure needs to be put on European governments to do that. That is the only way that we will succeed in restoring freedom and democracy. We have to root out the anti-freedom, anti-democratic tendencies within our own societies and expose them to full sunlight. Too often, many people in Western societies have tried to say there's some kind of moral equivalence, that all of these systems are equal. They're not equal. We know that freedom and democracy is what people want. When people are free to choose, they choose freedom. And that is what we should be proud of representing, and that's what we should be standing up for in our own societies. Let's be honest, for the past 25 years, freedom and democracy has been on the retreat. We have seen the advance of the axis of aggression. We have seen those countries becoming more economically powerful, more militarily powerful, and more aggressive. I believe that 2025 represents the turning point. And I believe at the heart of that turning point is what happens in Iran. There are two choices we have: a nuclear-aided Iran, a close ally of Russia, China, and North Korea, able to wreak havoc, not just inside Iran, but also in the wider Middle East, and destabilize the world. The other choice is a non-nuclear, free and democratic Iran with a positive future for its people and a reduced authoritarian axis that no longer is able to expand its influence around the world. President Reagan talked about the idea of peace through strength. That is what we now need to demonstrate, that we are prepared to take strong action using our economic levers, that we are prepared to spend on our defense, that we are prepared to promote our values of freedom and democracy. And that is how we will back the people of Iran, but in doing so, we will also back freedom and democracy across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to the Right Honourable Liz Truss. I was very much looking forward to hearing you speak, and I can see that our audience were equally delighted, so we thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be staying in the United Kingdom as I call on our next speaker to address you. He is none other than the Right Honourable John Bercow, the former Speaker of the United Kingdom House of Commons, a steadfast supporter of the democratic values of the Iranian democratic opposition. His unwavering advocacy for freedom and justice highlights the need for global solidarity and confronting the Iranian regime and championing regime change for the Iranian people and by the Iranian people. Ladies and gentlemen, please do join me in welcoming the Right Honourable John Bercow.
Thank you. Azadi, Mrs. Rajavi, whom I think we all rejoice in saluting, Prime Ministers, Generals, Parliamentarians, Ashraf III, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for welcoming me and giving me the opportunity to be amongst your number today, which I regard again as an undiluted privilege. And I should like at the outset to say what I have previously said to Mrs. Rajavi and also to my good friend Fazin Hashimi, who was in touch with me the other day. There are two things that are most striking about your events. One is that they are always, without fail, invariably organised with meticulous attention to detail and operated with clockwork efficiency. And the second characteristic of your events, which I think will probably strike some of our European and our American friends, but certainly always strikes me in the British context, having attended several of them, is this. As you Americans would say, when it comes to support for the NCRI, we have a tradition of operating across the aisle. That is to say, whatever else divides people in the United Kingdom polity, there are people of right and left and centre alike who regard it as their pleasure and responsibility, Mrs. Rajavi, without hesitation or flinching, to support you, because you are the embodiment of vision, courage, sacrifice, and leadership. As has been poignantly observed by earlier speakers, by General Jones and by Prime Minister Truss, the regime is, I think, indubitably at the weakest point that we have known, and that weakness is pithily described and characterized. It is manifested in the form of what must be the weakest economic situation that any of us can recall, marked by hyperinflation, appalling living standards, terrible want of a kind that we in our country don't know, and a scarcity of the most basic essentials, which frankly causes most of us to shed tears on reflection on it. Appalling economic disadvantage, which is systemic and I think irrevocable. That is, of course, accompanied by what in one sense is the most encouraging phenomenon, which is those uprisings of 2022. People standing up in their own communities, individually and together, saying, up with this, as Churchill would have said, we will not put. And alongside that, if you want a further expression, a manifestation of public discontent, you see it in the form of those boycotts of the two sham, and I repeat, the two sham, utterly sham elections. One of the things about these misogynistic mullahs is that they seem to think that they're so clever that everybody else is stupid. But people are not stupid. You're not stupid. You can see perfectly well for yourselves that those elections were in no sense representations of public opinion, not for one moment. And that's why millions of people decided to reject and eschew them, to take no part in them, because they were utterly corrupt and fixed. In recent times also, alongside all the cruel and unjust, utterly unjust deaths, there was one death, the death of Ibrahim Raisi, which offered both simultaneously a body blow to the regime and a source of great succor to those who believe in life, liberty, justice, the rule of law, democracy, pluralism, and the chance to live a life of the pursuit of happiness. Do not underestimate the blow that that represented to Khomeini, that stalwart supplicant of his is no longer. And then, as Prime Minister Truss very properly and legitimately pointed out, Hezbollah has sustained massive collateral damage. And the people who are frit, as Margaret Thatcher would have said, frit, it's an old-fashioned, ladies and gentlemen, Lincolnshire term meaning frightened, frit by what has happened to Hezbollah are the misogynist mullahs in Tehran, because they drew huge support from Hezbollah, that terroristic and tyrannical agent of their political desires and goals. And then when you see alongside all of that, perhaps the most significant event of all, namely the fall of the Assad regime, you realize that there is a chance, there is a possibility, there is a prospect, there is an imaginable destination of freedom on the march, freedom being triumphant, freedom prevailing. But as has been referenced, with some world-weary cynicism, about which I, for one, make no complaint, there have, for all too long, and there still are now, people fundamentally of goodwill who nevertheless do not understand the dictators, the totalitarians, the megalomaniac totalitarians' mindset, and who delude themselves that one more push by gentle diplomatic means, one more nice conversation in the margins, one more nice effort on the telephone or by Zoom in diplomatic parlance will suffice to get thoroughly unreasonable people to be reasonable. These, whether they know it or not, are the counsellors of despair, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, of course, as we know, and as has been articulated in other terms, appeasement just doesn't work. Being nice to dictators is regarded not as the exertion of influence, but as the demonstration of weakness. It is simply a sign of weakness. I hope I can be forgiven for repeating today what I had the pleasure of saying on a previous occasion from our own United Kingdom experience. At the time of the wartime government in 1939 and up until early May 1940, that government practiced and preached the philosophy of appeasement. And it was the late and great Winston Churchill who said of that government that he observed them on the Treasury bench, the government front bench, and that they appeared to be resolved only to be irresolute, adamant for drift, all-powerful to be impotent, and that needed to be decisively changed. And it was. And yet there are still people who say in the Iranian context there is no alternative. And I think what those of us here to support you in our different ways, with our different words, but with a similar message, are here to assert today is that this is the alternative. The existence of a 4.5-decade-long established resistance force characterized by its commitment to democracy, to pluralism, to justice, to the rule of law, to environmental propriety, to equality for women, for a secular state, for the abolition of the death penalty, and indeed for a changed constitution and a non-nuclear state. So that is the alternative. It is a democratic alternative. What's more, by virtue of its track record of selfless and sacrificial resistance, it is hugely experienced, hugely learned, hugely well organized. And the MEC resistance units, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them across the country, have as their most stellar quality, and this has been impressed upon me time and time again over the years by the resistance movement, the fact that they are not imposed upon, they are not threats to, they spring out of, they come from, they are interwoven with the Iranian society because they are part of the country. And if the regime dares to remove one, another will replace him or her within minutes or hours or days. So those resistance units speak to and are representative of the democratic strength of the mass of the Iranian people. And because Mrs. Rajavi is too gracious, modest, and self-effacing to say it herself, I think we need to say it for her. How dramatically apposite and telling it is that the National Council of Resistance of Iran is represented by the most eloquent symbol of gender equality, of belief in freedom, of pursuit of justice, of somebody who has spent decades of her life making the most enormous sacrifices. Because I think, Mrs. Rajavi, you understand that the achievement of power is not an end in itself, but a means to the realization of the hopes, the dreams, the expectations of the people whom you are here to serve. Isn't that, my friends, a lesson that the regime ought to take to heart? They're there to serve themselves. You, Maryam Rajavi, and the NCRI are in business to serve your people. That is the difference. So I think, my friends, we have disposed, General Jones disposed and Prime Minister Truss disposed of the notion that there is no alternative, because this is the alternative. And what's more, as evidence that none of you can ever be accused of sitting satisfied with what you've got, you have, since our last meeting, thanks, Mrs. Rajavi, to your presentation in the European Parliament and your appearance in Washington as well, you have added a new spoke to the wheel, and that is a specific, itemized, timed game plan from where we are to where we need to be. I echo, very explicitly echo, what has already been said about the importance of the exertion of external pressure in the form of robust sanctions, of course. But we know that you're not looking for outside assistance. This is not an Iraq or an Afghanistan or a Kosovo or a Sierra Leone. It's not like that. What you're looking for is our acceptance, the international community's acceptance, a global acceptance that there is an alternative, that you yourselves are that democratic alternative, and that there is a route map. And that route map is about the establishment of an interim government. So the naysayers, the negativists, the doom mongers who say nothing could be done because it will be chaos are just wrong. The source of the chaos is the existing genocidal, belligerent, bestial, egregious, execrable, how many more adjectives do I need, regime. And the antidote to that is to have an interim government which is initially there for a period of 6 months and which then creates the basis for and segues seamlessly into an election process. Not a sham election process, but a handing of power to the people for the creation of a democratically elected legislature which reflects the free and expressed will of the Iranian people. And that legislature is, if you will, the reflection of the election, step 2. And step 3 is that period of 2 years government which crafts a new constitution to be put to the people of Iran. So never, ever, from this day on, let it be said that there isn't an alternative. The alternative, by the way, to killing people en masse is to stop killing people en masse. The alternative to dictatorship is to establish a democracy. And having got a democracy, people can choose by whom and in what way they are to be governed. That's the way forward. Mrs. Rajavi, for showing the people of Iran a way forward, for building their support, for sticking at it through thick and thin. You do a signal service to your people, and I hope it will also be agreed to our friends, and they are our friends, unquestionably our friends in Ukraine, fighting back despite the Russian yoke. Despite the bestiality of that regime, the Ukrainian people know that they have right on their side, and they have the best of the international community on their side as well. So we stand together. We stand together, we stand in opposition to dictatorship, be it of the autocratic age of the Shah or of today's mullahs. And we stand for something different, something qualitatively better, something obviously, demonstrably, unanswerably, morally superior. And it's called democracy, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to the Right Honourable John Bercow. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honour and privilege to invite General Keith Kellogg, the former National Security Advisor and decorated military leader with decades of experience in US defence and international strategy. A strong advocate for confronting authoritarian regimes with an expertise on Iran's destabilizing role and the pathway to change. Ladies and gentlemen, please do give a very warm welcome to General Kellogg.
Thank you. I just mentioned to my old friend, General Jones, I have to follow you. He's wonderful. Prime Minister, wonderful. Ms. Rajavi, Excellencies, distinguished guests, friends of NCRI, thank you for having me today. And for the members of Ashraf 3, thank you for being in the audience as well. Our messages today are, in fact, quite similar, and they were not rehearsed beforehand, but the message is quite the same. For Iran, these days, for the people of Iran, those that believe in her and the promise of a brighter future are the most promising since the 1979 revolution. I believe this year should be considered a year of hope. It should be considered a year of action, and it should be considered a year of change. The regime in Iran is weaker and more vulnerable than it has been in decades. Much of that is because of strategic overreach by her current leaders, and also because select countries have demonstrated the inherent weakness of the current Iranian regime. They should not be feared. They should be challenged, and change must occur, and it must occur now. Regime weakness has reopened what the future of Iran will look like. While it is in fact cautionary, time is moving towards a different and a freer Iran. The stakes for the world are enormous, not just for the region, but for the rest of the world. Look at the positive that changes would occur in a changed Iran. We see that in Lebanon, in the destruction of Hezbollah. We saw what happened in Syria with the regime being changed. We saw what happened in Gaza and the defeat of Hamas. We saw with the relations with Israel and the Saudis how they can be corrected. And we see the connection all to Russia as well. The rest of the world, for a changed Iran, it is all for the good. The beginning of the end of Iran's primacy began, ironically, a year ago on 7 October. The principal backer of both Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon was Iran. They would, unfortunately for them, would reap the whirlwind of an Israel that was outraged, as was the world. A day of deranged success by Hamas in the massacre of civilians ended what I believe to be the beginning, the start of the end to the Iranian regime. They just didn't realize or know it. The leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah and Syria are all gone, something that a year ago most of the world would not have believed could have happened. Iranian influence has been greatly diminished. Many of you in this room helped to build the potential for a brighter future, and when the history of this is written, you will hold a page in history. We know inside Iran that Iran's leaders rule by coercion. Innocents have paid a terrible price. Outwardly, there were elections, sham elections, but they were not even remotely close to what we believed in the West to be elections at all. Ultimately, ultimate authority resides in the hands today of unelected clerics. Repression of the Iranian people is the standard. Freedom for Iranians is fleeting, but that should change and will change in the coming weeks and months ahead. And this must change. And I believe the window to this change is greater for the world than ever before. On a dual path for America, our highest priority in the region is the expansion of Iran's nuclear energy program. They must not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Their malfeasance in the region runs a second to that. I could not think of anything more destabilizing to the region, in fact to the world, than of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. We realize that to some of you in this room, Iranian malfeasance has been exposed, but for many of this room, not only was there malfeasance exposed, but the threat of the nuclear engagement in growth was exposed. I think all of you will ask the question, do you believe that if the Iranians develop a nuclear weapon, that other states in the Gulf would not follow similar paths, or others in the region as well? Of course they would. But there are activities to create turmoil in the region, the Iranians must be reduced as well. So we see a duality, a more democratic Iranian regime, and one that is not a regional or even a global threat, but a friend to the West and a friend to democracy. The opportunity is to change Iran for the better. It is current, but it is my experience that this opportunity will not last forever. The good and immediate news is that the world will soon have an American president who truly understands change. He is fearless in his pursuit and knows what we in America call the art of the deal, what is doable and what is decisive for success. A president who will demand strange things to the world, but will follow through. Remember, President Donald J. Trump in his first term walked away from the Iran nuclear deal against incredible opposition, both in the United States and the world as well. He was right. While we have been consistently ignorant, we in the world, until I believe President Trump, of Iranian leadership, intentions to our constant peril, because we always seem to assume that Iranian leaders were in fact what we call in the United States of America, Jeffersonian Democrats. This has been a fault of both Republican and Democratic administrations, and the blame is widespread. I'm reminded of what the late Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, a gentleman by the name of Will Durant, said when he wrote his famous 11-volume treatise on the story of civilization, when he said, quote, "We seem to be working on the assumption that if we are nice to other people, they will be nice to us. I can tell you in the last 4,000 years, there has been no evidence to share that vision." And he's right. During the 2016 presidential election, President Trump excoriated the Iran nuclear deal. And in May 2018, we began a campaign of maximum pressure on Iran's leaders. The pressure economically for us began to work. For example, Iran's oil imports dropped from more than 2 million barrels of oil a day to 400,000 a day. Foreign currency fell to just $4 billion, their lowest level in decades. We believe we had the regime, which included the petroleum sector, on the run, because we believe that Iran's petrochemical and petroleum sectors are the primary source of funding for the regime and for external terrorism. This was backed by their knowledge we would deter any type of terrorist activity in the region, and eventually we confirmed that with the eventual elimination in Iran's Quds Force leader, Qasem Soleimani. As an example of fortitude, the attacks that caused his demise started on the 1st of January that year. On the 3rd of January, Soleimani was dead. We understand the global threat of an Iran, and especially of a nuclear Iran. The question is, how do you achieve the objectives of a more democratic and a freer government, and the one that is less fleeting? For the United States, a policy of maximum pressure must be reinstated, and it must be reinstated with the help of the rest of the globe. And that includes standing with the Iranian people and their aspirations for democracy. These pressures are not just kinetic, just not military force, but they must be economic and diplomatic as well. The pressure should not be just from the U.S. alone, and not just from the region alone, be it the Saudis or the Emiratis, but it also must be from the globe. This is where diplomacy for this administration, the incoming administration, and the world is vital. The 10-point plan for the future of Iran ensures a clear transitional path to a more friendly, stable, non-belligerent, and a non-nuclear Iran. That needs to be the near-term goal for all of us in this room. We must exploit the weakness we now see. The hope is there. So much to be the action. Thank you for having me today, and let's free Iran this year.
Thank you very much indeed to General Kellogg. Thank you also for pointing out the terrifying prospects of a nuclear Iran, which really doesn't bear thinking about. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, I'm very, very honored to introduce another general, General Tod Wolters, a distinguished military leader and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. With extensive experience in international security and strategic operations, General Wolters brings invaluable insight into countering Iran's destabilizing efforts and fostering stability in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, please do join me in welcoming General Wolters onto the stage.
Maryam Rajavi, Prime Ministers, Excellencies, Speaker, to all of the loved ones and the family members of the National Commission of Resistance of Iran, and I'm certain that I speak for all of us, to all of the great patriots on the screen that represent Ashraf 3, it is a privilege to be in your company. Thank you. It's a personal and professional honor to have this opportunity to address a subject that is so near and dear to our hearts and so represents all of the freedom-loving people that exist across the globe. The challenge is unique, the timing is right. What has happened for the last 4 decades is astounding. What we believe will happen in the very near future will be incredible. And it centers around the fact that a free globe and a loving globe is one that starts with the great citizens of Iran being represented by a democratic government. The regime's nefariousness has existed for far too long. And all of you, for 4 decades plus, have given your blood, sweat, and tears to correct it. We know this. Today, the campaign momentum is on our side, not on the regime's. I'll be brief because I concur so much with exactly what Prime Minister Truss said, with what the Speaker said, and with what General Kellogg said. We have a strategy. We have a plan. We have a fragile regime. And we have just witnessed a strategic event that dictates to us that now is our time. As we've witnessed what has happened to the regime, as we've seen the transition in Syria, it tells us the conditions are correct on the ground and the conditions are correct strategically to tell all of us that it is now high time to go into full gear and advance our cause and get rid of the regime. Maryam Rajavi has been very, very clear in setting the conditions. We have a comprehensive 6-month plan, and we have a set of milestones that take us to the next 2 years and tell us what we need to do with each passing moment when we wake up. And the test of the endurance of those plans and milestones rests in the fact that from a diplomatic perspective, from an information perspective, from a military perspective, and from an economic perspective, that plan is sound, and it has gained momentum for the last several years. And on top of the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic sufficiency, that plan provides for us to comfortably put in place a set of conditions with a government that comprehensively covers what we do in the judicial, what we do in the legislative, and what we do in the executive branches. So as we look at the plan from top to bottom and bottom to top, it is very comprehensive. And when we examine all of those conditions that Prime Minister Truss so sagely pointed out, we find ourselves in 2025 saying, now is the time. Let me close by leaving you with our last task. Given everything that the speakers have addressed up to this point, it is very, very obvious to us that conditions are right. We all know this. No matter how many times you make a statement, no matter how many times you repeat the obvious, it is always worth repeating one more time. The information environment is yearning for repetitive comments from us on exactly what it is we are doing. And with the campaign momentum that we've addressed and shoring up the environment from an informational perspective, I think all of us would agree that we are ready, and 2025 is going to be a transformative year for the great citizens that represent a free and democratic Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to General Wolters. Ladies and gentlemen, by way of housekeeping and courtesy, may I ask that you kindly tune into Channel 4 on your headsets in order to listen to our next speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, there are few individuals who embody resilience and the fight for freedom as powerfully as our next speaker, Yulia Tymoshenko. As Ukraine's former Prime Minister and a steadfast advocate for democracy, she has, of course, faced and overcome immense challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, please do join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Ms. Tymoshenko.
Дякую, дорогі друзі, дякую. Дякую. Дякую дуже. Дякую. Я безмежно дякую вам за такий теплий прийом. І так відчуваю, що це прийом для України в цілому. Дуже дякую. Дорога пані Марям Раджаві, дорогі друзі, члени нашої конференції, учасники нашої конференції, високоповажний, вільний та демократичний народ Ірану, Ашраф 3, я також вас вітаю всіх. Сьогодні ми з вами всі тут, щоб засудити режим, чия жорстокість і агресія виходять далеко за межі його кордонів. Іранський режим є одним з найсерйозніших викликів для всього глобального світу, для його стабільності. Це сила, яка не лише поневолює власний народ, але ця сила експортує тероризм, розпалює конфлікти, підриває демократію в усьому світі. Цю силу потрібно негайно зупиняти. Негайно. І це абсолютно по силам демократичному світу. Як українка, я не можу не наголосити на тотальному зв'язку між діями іранського режиму та війною, яку Росія розв'язала проти моєї країни. Постачаючи дрони, ракети, іншу військову підтримку Росії, іранське керівництво стало співучасником всіх кривавих вбивств в Україні. Вбивств дітей, мирних родин, вбивств наших військових. Все це робить Росія разом з Іраном. І тут не треба це скидати з рахунку. Проте сьогодні вже не раз було сказано, що попри свою агресію, іранський режим сьогодні слабший, ніж будь-коли. Усередині країни він стикається з серйозною економічною кризою. Гіперінфляція, високий рівень безробіття, тотальна корупція – це все викликає масове невдоволення народу. І це, безумовно, супроводжується протестами, страйками, демонстраціями, які вже стали майже щоденною реакцією. Я можу вам сказати, що не послабляйте протести, страйки, демонстрації, бо Україна знає, що це спрацьовує проти диктатур.
І це шлях до визволення. Будьте сильними на цьому шляху. Режим намагається діяти проти вас жорсткими репресіями, включаючи масові страти, але хай вас це не робить слабкішими. Всі ці дії лише демонструють слабкість і відчай режиму. Вони мусять тільки посилювати ваш опір і йти вперед. На міжнародній арені Іран зазнає тотальних поразок. Такого я не пам'ятаю в історії, щоб так яскраво це було. Ослаблення його союзників, Хезболла, втрата впливу в Сирії ще більше ізолюють цей режим. Нещодавно стало відомо, що Тегеран активізує свої ядерні програми у спробі зберегти владу. Но я вам хочу сказати, що так само Росія, коли починає програвати на фронтах в Україні, вони теж зразу декларують ядерний шантаж. Не бійтеся цього, і це тільки демонструє слабкість кожного режиму, це декларації про ядерну зброю. Я думаю, що нам просто треба цю слабкість враховувати. Ми мусимо зрозуміти все. Ми мусимо зробити все, щоб слабкість іранського режиму була і світом, і іранським народом використана по повній, просто по повній. На міжнародній арені Іран зазнає стратегічних поразок, але підтримка Росії з боку Ірану у війні проти України є кричущим прикладом дестабілізації впливу цього режиму в усьому світі. Постачаючи зброю Росії, Іран долучився до нападу на суверенітет, на демократію, на територіальну цілісність України. Ця зброя не лише вбиває українців, але, на жаль, надихає авторитарні режими в усьому світі. Дії іранського режиму в Україні мають серйозні міжнародні наслідки. Вони загострюють гуманітарну кризу та створюють ще більш нестабільне глобальне середовище. Це має стати потужним сигналом для міжнародної спільноти. Політика умиротворення щодо цього режиму провалилася, і вона не має права бути продовжена. Десятиліття поступок лише зміцнили Тегеран. Нам потрібні рішучі дії, щоб послабити цей режим і підтримати тих, хто бореться за свободу в Ірані. На щастя, майбутнє Ірану не обов'язково має відображати його репресивне минуле. Іранський народ, очолюваний Національною радою опору Ірану, демонструє неймовірну мужність у своїй боротьбі за свободу. Під сильним, мудрим керівництвом пані Марям Раджаві Norway представила чіткий план для вільного та демократичного Ірану. Це чіткі 10 пунктів, які передбачають ключові для всього демократичного світу цінності – свободу, демократію, вільні вибори, гендерну рівність, яку ми зараз, до речі, бачимо от на екрані, коли я дивлюся зараз, то тут точно гендерна нерівність, тому що тут жінок значно більше, і це дуже добре. Я взагалі хочу сказати, що особливо надихає роль жінок у цій боротьбі, чесно вам скажу, тому що я теж, як жінка, не дуже таку собі слабку боротьбу пройшла. І тому, коли я бачу боротьбу жінок, це якось надає сили. Жінки знаходяться... Жінки знаходяться сьогодні в Ірані на передовій опору. І коли вони вигукують «жінка, життя, свобода», ці слова вже переросли в гасло «жінка, опір, свобода», тому що це нероздільні речі. Ці сміливі жінки, лідери протестів, члени підпільних рухів, символи мужності є серцем руху за повалення режиму. Їхня боротьба надихає жінок у всьому світі. І я можу вам сказати, коли сьогодні наші жінки в Україні з автоматами в руках, які знаходяться і, власне, непогано користуються артилерійською зброєю, жінки, які очолюють гуманітарні ініціативи в Україні, які залишаються стійкими перед обличчям агресії, беруть приклад з іранських жінок. І ви дуже сильний приклад. Слава іранським жінкам, які є символом опору диктатури. Дорогі друзі, іранський народ не просить вас про військову інтервенцію чи фінансову допомогу. Він просить просто моральної і політичної підтримки. Всього лише моральної і політичної підтримки. І настав час чітко і публічно визнати НРОЄ законним голосом іранського народу. Це визнання стане потужним сигналом для Тегерану про те, що світ підтримує тих, хто бореться за свободу, а не тих, хто тримається за диктатуру і за владу насильства. Крім того, союз іранського режиму з Росією підкреслює необхідність самих рішучих дій. Як світ підтримує Україну в її боротьбі проти російської агресії, так само ми повинні підтримати іранський народ в його боротьбі. А що означає підтримати? Перше – це засудити підтримку Іраном війни Росії проти України та викрити його роль у розпалюванні конфлікту. Це перше. Друге – посилити санкції проти режиму, прикриваючи його фінансові потоки та доступ до ресурсів, а не імітуючи ці санкції. Потрібно їх зробити дієвими. Третє. Притягнути Тегеран до відповідальності за його ядерні програми та забезпечити сурове дотримання міжнародних норм. Міжнародні норми не мусять бути пустим звуком, їх треба виконувати. І по відношенню до Тегерану це треба зробити в першу чергу. І останнє, я ще раз підкреслюю, що визнання, моральна і політична підтримка іранському народу та його організованому опору є нашим обов'язком, а не факультативом. Пані та панове, падіння іранського режиму – це лише питання часу. Мужність іранського народу, стійкість його організованого опору та лідерство пані Мар'яни Раджаві роблять це неминучим. Вільний Іран не лише звільнить свій народ, але й усуне дестабілізуючу силу зі світової арени, сприяючи миру на Близькому Сході та далеко за його межами. Не можна недооцінювати силу солідарності. Як Україна бореться за свій суверенітет, демократію, цілісність своїх кордонів, так само народ Ірану бореться за свою свободу. І одна, і друга боротьба дуже взаємопов'язані, адже вони представляють універсальну боротьбу між тиранією та свободою, між гнобленням і справедливістю. І можу вам сказати, що разом ми можемо з вами гарантувати, що майбутнє належатиме тим, хто бореться за свободу. Разом ми можемо з вами перемагати. Разом ми побудуємо світ, у якому жоден режим, чи то в Тегерані, чи то в Москві, не зможе тримати свій народ або сусідів у заручниках. Давайте зробимо це разом. Україна з вами, вільний народ Ірану. Дякую за увагу. Дякую.
Thank you very much indeed to Yulia Tymoshenko. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on now from one strong leader to another. It's my honor to invite onto the stage the former Prime Minister of Slovenia, Mr. Janez Janša, a prominent leader in European politics, known especially for his strong stance on defending democratic values and sovereignty. Mr. Janša brings critical insight into how Western democracies can, and in my opinion should, effectively confront authoritarian regimes, including, of course, Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, please do welcome onto the stage Mr. Janša.
Thank you very much. You are great. Mrs. President, Maryam Rajavi, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, esteemed leaders, dear friends in Albania, in Ashraf. Thank you for this honor to be able to address you at this important conference. We have said this many times, and we are going to repeat this message as long as needed. The people of Iran deserve democracy, freedom, and the protection of human rights. It was said many times, but as I said, we will repeat it as long as it is needed. And the international community has to provide unwavering support to their aspirations. Today, we confront a profound crisis that challenges both regional and international peace and security, driven by the Iranian regime. This regime not only perpetuates severe international repression, but has also broadened its destructive influence across borders, not only in its neighborhood, but also through its open military support for Russia and against Ukraine, as it was described by Prime Minister Tymoshenko recently. For over 45 years, Europe's policy towards Iran has primarily focused on attempting to change the regime's behavior through a strategy of carrots and sticks, regrettably far too often offering carrots, as it was very accurately described before by Prime Minister Truss. So I will not repeat because I agree completely with what you have said. As I said, this policy has failed, mostly because it has overlooked the most critical elements in Iran. The people themselves, and the organized resistance movement that is active nationwide under the leadership of President Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. The past year marked a dramatic escalation in the regime's brutal tactics, with some 1,000 executions recorded. I repeat, recorded. I believe that there are many others which are not recorded, and we have to be aware of that. In July 2024 report, UN Special Rapporteur on Iran found Iranian officials responsible for ongoing crimes against humanity and genocide. Even the United Nations, the organization which has not been very accurate describing the situation in totalitarian regimes, notice this. So it has to be tragic. Internally, Iran faces an economic meltdown and a citizenry that resists despite severe crackdowns. Regionally, the shocking fall of Assad, a linchpin of the Iranian regime's Middle East strategy, has significantly unhinged the regime, exposing its vulnerabilities and diminishing its strategic foothold in the region. This was described by previous speakers, so I will not go into details. We had European elections last year. There will be significant changes in the United States in the policy toward the Middle East, as it was described before by the esteemed speakers from the United States. This is why I think that also the partially new EU leadership, especially the part of it under the foreign policy stewardship of the High Representative, Madam Kaja Kallas, presents an opportune moment to recalibrate EU approach towards Iran. We must transition from engagement to a posture of firmness, reflecting the gravity of the Iranian regime's actions and the resilience of its people. Part and parcel of that recalibration must be to stand with the organized, structured resistance movement in Iran. This is very important. The European Union revised strategy should emphasize, first, rigorous enforcement of existing sanctions, then blacklisting the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. This is not very difficult to be done. Only political decision is needed, but it will has significant repercussions. Then, introduction of targeted new measures to cut off the regime's financial lifelines, particularly, as it was also described before, through the oil exports. Then the closure of at least some regime's diplomatic outposts in Europe, which have been misused as hubs for orchestrating terrorism, and also the expulsion of Tehran's operatives who continue their malignant activities on European soil. Everything was proven, so there is no secret in this. It just has to be done. Then, of course, strong support for the National Council of Resistance of Iran and its democratic vision. Mrs. Rajavi, it has been said before, but it's worth to be repeated. 10-point plan for Iran's future highlights crucial commitments to democracy, human rights, and a non-nuclear status, aiming to replace tyranny with a government that respects the dignity and freedoms of its people. So this is the alternative. And also a recognition of the struggle of the Iranian people and the resistance units against the Revolutionary Guard. We have seen the downfall of Assad. Tyrants do fall. The theocracy ruling Iran is no exception. And it is crucial to clarify that when we discuss regime change, we are not advocating a return to any kind of dictatorship, but endorsing the establishment of the democratic republic. This is the alternative. And change and, as you said before, this is the moment. Change in Iran is inevitable. Regime change and peaceful transition of power back to the Iranian people is crucial. Also because this is the only viable solution to stop exporting terrorism, bringing peace and stability to the Middle East and wider region. And for the end, my sincere advice regarding peaceful transition of power after the collapse of the Mullah regime. Peaceful transition is a very noble goal. Victor has to be generous, not to retaliate against ordinary members of, or followers of the regime. But for the leadership of the regime, for those who committed terrible crimes against your compatriots, who murdered your brothers and sisters, taking them as political prisoners, for the prosecutors of the regime, there has to be justice. There has to be justice. Also, because of the historical lesson. History teaches us that unpunished evil always returns. Unpunished evil always comes back. There was no justice after collapse of the evil empire of the Soviet Union. And this is the main reason. This is the main reason we are facing Russian aggression against Ukraine. Don't repeat this mistake. But first the change has to happen. To make this change a reality as soon as possible, it is crucial to recognize that Iran has a democratic alternative in the form of the National Council of the Resistance of Iran, which has presented a clear plan for the transition, and it deserves international support, unwavering international support. The new, or partially new, EU leadership has to extend the gratitude to all of you for your dedication and unwavering commitment to the cause of a free Iran, which brings peace and stability to the region as well. Your fight for freedom is our common fight for peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to Prime Minister Janša for your very powerful remarks. I'd also like to personally thank Prime Minister Janša and other speakers for calling on the prescription of the IRGC in certain countries, including the UK. Ladies and gentlemen, in this part of our conference, I'm delighted to say that by virtue of the powers of technology, we will be going over to Ashraf 3, where we will be hearing from two of the residents there. Please do welcome Nadere Afshar as well as Majid Alireza Hajirzadeh, who will address our gathering. Thank you.
Hello to all of our dear guests, especially President-elect Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. My name is Nadere. I wanted to wish you all a very happy new year. I wish we could have this conversation in person, but hopefully soon. I was born in France, so I've never had the chance to see my homeland. Although when I was 3 years old, I moved to Iraq with my parents, where I was attending kindergarten. But during the Gulf War, I was relocated to Canada so that I could grow up in a more safer environment. A few weeks after my relocation, my father was assassinated by the Iranian mercenaries inside Iraq. And next month is actually his anniversary. In the past recent years, the world has increasingly awakened to the regime's terrorism throughout the Middle East. It's not something that began just in 2023. It actually dates back all the way back to the 1980s. And my father was just one amongst the countless victims of the Iranian regime's terrorism. Losing my father was one of the most difficult moments of my life. And so I empathize deeply with the thousands of children whose parents have been victims to this regime's terrorism. However, I am confident that all these hardships will soon come to an end. And 2025 will be the year of a free Iran, and the Middle East will see peace. So I thank you very much for being with us, standing with the resistance, for supporting the 10-point plan of Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, and hopefully soon we will see you in a free Iran. Thank you so much.
We've gathered here to warmly extend the sincerest greetings on behalf of all Ashraf 3 residents to you, our dear friends and the great supporters of the Iranian Resistance, and to you, dear Sister Maryam, wishing you a Happy New Year. First, thank you for taking the time to listen to this message. My name is Majid Haji Ali Rezai. I was born 8 months before the fall of the Shah, and until the age of 22, I witnessed nothing, but there was relentless operation of the clerical regime of Iran. When Mohammad Khatami assumed the presidency of the regimes, I was in my second year of university. Up to that time, living under the complete censorship and repression, I was unaware of the realities about the resistance and Mujahedin. I naively hoped that Khatami might bring about positive changes. However, in June 1999, Khatami revealed his true nature, attempting to crush our generation as well. In 2000, I graduated with a BS degree in mechanical engineering, specializing in solid mechanics. At that time, seeing no future for my country, I decided to pursue further studies in the United States and had completed all the necessary preparations. However, my encounter with the resistance movement and Mujahedin changed my path entirely. Within 2 months of getting to know the Mujahedin, I joined their ranks in Ashraf. I witnessed how they consistently and selflessly sacrificed for their cause and freedom. And this gave me a hope, something that I hadn't before. And this made me believe that change is possible. I'm sure that you are aware of the particular challenges which our resistance has faced, especially after the occupation of the Iraq. Yet, I must say that with each passing day, my initial hope has transformed into an unshakable faith. This is also evident in the younger generations in Iran today. Despite the regime's relentless pressure and daily execution, Mujahedin has gained a remarkable position among the people of Iran, and especially the young men and women. Not a day goes without symbols of the regime's operation being set aflame by resistance units who fighting for freedom. Indeed, this is a path toward the freedom and overthrow of this brutal regime. With optimism, we aspire a spring where, much like the fate of dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, Khamenei too will be overthrown. Finally, I look forward to welcoming you to a free Iran, where I hope to share in person the incredible sacrifices made by the brave generations in Iran in their pursuit of freedom. Thank you for your presence, and together let us strive for a brighter future.
Thank you very much indeed to the residents of Ashraf 3. I'd also like to personally thank all of the residents for their courage, for their resilience, and of course their service and self-sacrifice to the people of Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, in this part of our conference, I would like to invite onto the stage the delegation of Iranian academics representing a number of countries across Europe. Their presentation will be given by Mr. Ali Bagheri, a senior academic from Belgium. Please do welcome the delegation onto the stage.
Ms. Rajavi, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests, allow me at first to welcome you to the House of the Resistance of Iran, and also we express our greetings to our freedom fighters in Ashraf 3, our brothers and sisters, and thank you for your presence in this important conference. In your remarkable speeches, you pointed out to the main important things, to the historical moment that we are at, and also to the role of the resistance of Iran and to the role of the people of Iran in this change. In the continuation of your remarkable speeches, I would like to address a new element that has completely transformed the landscape of resistance and protest within Iran, which are the resistance units of the People's Mujahedin Organization of Iran. Reflecting on my own experience, I could not have imagined that in such a short period of time, resistance units would achieve to this level of capability, readiness, and operational capability in such a short period of time. Every day we witness their courageous operations across Iran, acts of defiance organized in response to the regime's crimes against our defenseless people. These actions serve as a beacon of hope, seen and felt by the Iranian people. They symbolize the MEK's unwavering commitment to overthrow the regime, even after 4 decades of resistance. This unwavering commitment is a critical factor in disrupting the regime's entire apparatus for demonizing the MEK. It's a point of trust, a trust we, the youth, have rediscovered in this resistance and in Ms. Rajavi's leadership and her resolve to build a free and prosperous Iran. But where does this trust originate? It stems from the MEK's pure ideology, which resonates deeply with the oppressed Iranian society. Ms. Rajavi's message is one of liberation, freedom from all forms of oppressions and restrictions. The young and rebellious generation of Iran has embraced this call for liberation, feeling its sense to their very core. This is why so many young Iranians have formed resistance units, dedicating their youth, their energy, their eyes, their heads, and even their lives to the ideals of freedom. For 40 years, this vision has inspired generation after generation. It has drawn elites, academics, artists, intellectuals, scientists to this cause, forging an enduring line of resistance. The resistance units are living proof of MEK's commitment to overthrowing the mullahs and the growing enthusiasm, acceptance, and expansion of the MEK within Iranian society. This is the undeniable reality and the driving force for regime change that Ms. Rajavi has cultivated within Iran. Thank you very much for your time and listening to me. Viva the resistance unit. And we all join this path to free Iran. Hazer, Hazer, Hazer. Hazer, 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 Hazer.
Thank you very much indeed to Ali Bagheri and the delegation of Iranian academics representing universities across Europe. We are, of course, as ready as you are. Ladies and gentlemen, on to the next speaker in this afternoon's programme, and it's my honour to invite onto the platform the Right Honourable David Jones, a former UK minister and a long-standing supporter of the Iranian people and their opposition, the NCRI and MEK. His unwavering commitment to advocating for democratic change in Iran and confronting the Iranian regime's oppressive policies provides critical perspective on the path forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please do welcome the Right Honourable David Jones.
Mrs. Rajavi, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, friends, it's a huge pleasure to be here today amongst so many distinguished colleagues from both sides of the Atlantic. And greetings too to my many friends in Ashraf 3. It's good to see you there in such strong numbers. As we gather here today in the early days of 2025, I believe that we have good reason to look forward with hope and optimism to the year ahead. For the best part of the last 20 years, I've taken a keen interest in the affairs of Iran. I've watched with dismay the oppressive, aggressive posture struck by the regime in Tehran and the impact that that has had upon the brave Iranian people, the progressive deterioration in human rights that they have endured. I was for many years the chairman of the British Parliamentary Committee for Iran Freedom, and I was proud to be one of the claimants in the action in the European Court of Justice, which resulted in the deproscription of the PMOI, not only in Europe, but also in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And as other speakers have already said, it's a great shame that that deproscription has not been followed by the proscription of the IRGC. Now, I fully understand that anyone who does observe events in Iran might be forgiven for surrendering to despondency about its future. But I tell you that I am today more optimistic about the future of Iran than I have been over that 20-year period. Colleagues, consider the events of last year, of last month, December 2024, which witnessed the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. That was a huge loss to the regime in Tehran. Indeed, I believe it was a pivotal loss. For many years, Assad's Syria was an essential element, indeed I would suggest the linchpin of the malign influence that Iran has sought to exert over the entire Middle Eastern region. Syria provided a direct corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean. It enabled Tehran to continue to support its other proxy, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also to maintain its own military presence in Syria. Between 2012 and 2020, Tehran channeled at least $50 billion United States dollars into the civil conflict in Syria, together with injecting large investments in military infrastructure, demographic engineering, and religious projects. Maintaining such an influence in Syria came at a huge cost to Iran itself and to the Iranian people. It drained its economy and incurred huge human cost. But despite that cost, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, proved incapable of sustaining its intervention in Syria, and it rapidly collapsed last month in the face of a rebellion that took it seemingly by surprise. But let's be clear, that failure of the IRGC in Syria should send a strong and encouraging message to those within Iran who want to see a restoration of normal democratic institutions, because the message is this: even a large and heavily armed and well-funded autocracy can't sustain a large-scale revolt by those within the civil population who wish to be rid of it. Last month's events have shown Tehran to be highly vulnerable. The last few weeks have seen it stripped of its proxy in Syria, with diminished influence in Lebanon and Yemen. But these events are simply the latest reverses for the regime in a process that has been continuing for a considerable time. Over the last 6 years, as we've heard today, there have been 4 large-scale uprisings in Iran and a great number of continuing protests within the country by people who are angry at the economic mismanagement, rampant inflation, appalling unemployment levels, and the systemic corruption that are endemic within the country. And the death in May last year of Ebrahim Raisi was a huge blow to the supreme leader, who'd invested so much in him to secure the regime's continuation. The response of the regime to the increasing civil unrest follows the customary pattern of heavy-handed brutality. During 2024, as we have already heard, there were almost 1,000 recorded executions in Iran. 700 of those followed the election to the presidency of Masoud Pezeshkian, who, I remind you, was supposed to be the moderate candidate in that electoral process. But despite the brutality of the regime's response, the failure of the IRGC in Syria, and Iran's diminished influence within the region have simply emboldened the brave Iranian people. It's clear that those uprisings in Iran are going to continue. The resistance units and the general populace are fully determined to continue to challenge the regime's grip on power within Iran. The Iranian resistance has a unique approach. It doesn't seek financial or military support from any other country. Indeed, you, Mrs. Rajavi, have repeatedly said that the overthrow of the regime will only occur and will only be achieved by the Iranian people themselves and by the organized Iranian resistance. All that resistance seeks from the international community is the simple recognition of the right of the Iranian people, if that is indeed their will, to remove the regime and combat its repressive forces, specifically the IRGC. So really, the ball is in the court of the international community. Its policy towards Iran must shift decisively. As we've heard already, appeasement has failed. For decades now, attempts to deter Iran from its disruptive conduct through sanctions and diplomacy and appeasement have signally failed. Indeed, if anything, the regime's ambitions, including its nuclear ambitions, have become ever more strident. So the demands of the Iranian people for a regime change are entirely understandable, and they should be met with support from the international community. And consider the aims of the NCRI. They include establishing a pluralistic and non-nuclear republic in Iran, ensuring equality for women, minorities, and religious groups, and separating religion from the state and prioritizing peace and regional stability. Aren't those objectives entirely praiseworthy? Wouldn't their achievement be infinitely superior to the state of affairs that currently prevails in Iran? Aren't they objectives that the international community should not be supporting, but actively promoting? And put quite simply, if those aims were realized, wouldn't they establish within Iran the state of affairs that every Western liberal democracy simply takes for granted? So the Western world should now recognize and actively support the legitimacy of the ambitions of the Iranian people to replace the repressive regime in Tehran with something that reflects the ambitions of the organized resistance. Peace in the region, indeed peace in the wider world, demands a stable, secular, democratic Iran. And that is what the West should be seeking. And colleagues, lending Western support to the resistance in its efforts to achieve those ambitions will help realize what should be the aim of every Democrat here and outside. A stable, free, democratic Iran in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed to the Right Honourable David Jones. Ladies and gentlemen, in this part of our programme, I would like to invite onto the stage the delegation of Iranian youths from across countries in Europe. They will be represented by Neda Zabeti, who is a law student from London and an aspiring human rights lawyer. Please do welcome the delegation of Iranian youth onto the stage.
Mrs. Rajavi, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, salam, vitayu, and bonjour. It is very special to be stood in front of all of you today, especially Mrs. Rajavi. Mrs. Rajavi, I am sure you won't remember this, but this is a moment which is ingrained in my memory, and I think it is a true testament to your personality. I was just 3 years old, attending the annual Free Iran rally. You were walking past with your security, and I begged my dad to put me on his shoulders so that I could see you. As you walked past, I tried to greet you, but security, for safety reasons, denied me greeting you. Despite this, you walked directly up to me with a welcoming smile, and you held my cheek. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this story accurately displays Mrs. Rajavi's compassion and humility towards each and every person. Mrs. Rajavi, you are a role model for me and millions of other women worldwide, and for that we all thank you. My name is Neda, I'm 19 years old, and I'm a law student. I'm half Iranian, born and raised in the UK, having never visited Iran. This invaluable right to visit my own homeland, to experience my own culture, has been taken from me by a dictatorial government. Today, I'd like to share with you my journey of discovering more about Iran, why I became deeply interested in this situation, and what drew me to the People's Mujahedin Organization of Iran, and of course, for its future. Although I lived my entire life in the UK, my Iranian roots have always been a significant part of who I was growing up. I heard stories of the beauties of Iran, its rich culture, and its proud history, being one of the cradles of civilization and the original pioneer of the very human rights we hold so dear today. But unfortunately, each story was clouded with a sense of sadness, a longing for a free and a just Iran. My family spoke of the struggles, which now that I say out loud, is a complete understatement. I heard of the tragedies the Iranian people faced from their repressive, totalitarian regime. And as I grew older, I began to see these same stories reflected in the media, whether it be protests for democracy or calls for women's rights. It was no longer enough to simply hear about these stories. I wanted to understand what was happening, why it was happening, and how I could be an active participant in bringing about true, meaningful change. This journey led me to the MEK, an organization that has consistently been at the forefront of the struggle for a democratic Iran. What I found most inspiring about the MEK was its unwavering commitment to justice and its resilience, despite oppression, despite immense loss, and despite continuous self-sacrifice. The MEK's vision for a free Iran is profoundly hopeful and forward-thinking. An aspect of this vision which deeply resonates with me is Mrs. Maryam Rajavi's 10-point plan, especially in terms of women's rights and religious freedoms. Mrs. Rajavi believes in a future Iran where women, all women, no matter their religion, no matter their culture, no matter their clothing, are able to make their own decisions and participate in every single sphere of society, where equality is not a distant dream or an aspiration, but a lived reality. As a young person, especially one who was born outside of Iran, it brings me much hope. It shows that the future of Iran can be one of progress, one of inclusion, and one of opportunity for all. My interest in Iran is not just connecting with my heritage. It is about standing with the Iranian people, It is about standing with women. It's about standing with minority groups. It is about standing with blue-collar workers and laborers. And it is standing for the freedom of all people in Iran. The MEK has shown me that change is possible, but it requires courage, solidarity, and of course, action. It's a fight not just for Iranians, but for universal values of liberty, democracy, and equality. I would like to read an important and very applicable quote by Martin Luther King Jr. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." In closing, I want to express my gratitude to those who continue to fight for a free Iran and for organizations like the MEK that work tirelessly towards that goal. I would also like to thank those in Ashraf 3. Thank you for your hard work, your perseverance, your strength, your patience, and your passion for what is right. I was lucky enough to visit Ashraf 3 when I was much younger, and your kindness continues to radiate through the screen today. جای شما اینجا خالیه امروز. Sorry. As someone born in the UK, I am fortunate to enjoy freedoms that millions of Iranians are still fighting for to this day. It is a privilege and it is a responsibility to use my voice to amplify theirs. Let's do everything in our power to bring about this freedom sooner. Thank you.
Indeed to Neda and to the delegation of Iranian youth. I can tell you that it takes an enormous amount of courage to stand before prime ministers and ministers and generals. So I really am grateful to them for their support and for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, sadly our meeting is drawing to a close, and I'm going to invite our final speaker at this conference to address us. It's my personal privilege and honor to introduce Mr. Ola Elvestuen, the former Minister of Climate and Environment of Norway, and please do forgive me for my terrible pronunciation. Please do join me in welcoming him.
Mrs. Rajavi, Prime Ministers, distinguished speakers who have careers and experiences that makes me privileged to also be part of the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, both here and also in Ashraf 3, it's a privilege for me to be invited and to be here. And I will not try to sum up the speakers that have been here. But I think one of the cores that are here is that 2024 has been a year of unprecedented crisis for the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is weak. The regime's regional ambitions have suffered devastating blows. Hezbollah faces near destruction. The Houthis are in a very difficult situation. With the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the grip Iran maintained on Syria has slipped away and causing shockwaves in Tehran. And that is something I think we should also take in. How hard a blow the loss of Syria is to the Iranian regime. I think is much harder than is being recognized amongst the majority in the democratic world. These strategic defeats are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a regime that is running out of both resources and credibility, that is regionally and is also domestically. As has been pointed out, at home, the Iranian people face an economy in free fall. It is a situation that it's devastating for the economy. Severe energy shortages have made life very difficult, and particularly during the harsh winter months. In response to these dire conditions, protests have erupted across every sector of society. And as been pointed out, the regime's response has been horribly, with nearly 1,000 people that we know of that has been executed. Amidst these internal crises, as also many have said, Iran has alarmingly escalated its nuclear ambitions. So the seriousness in the situation is obvious. But we are also aware that at great risk, the resistance within Iran is getting stronger. And as was mentioned also with the uprisings that's been 2 years ago in Berlin with women, life, freedom, it is really also, when you look at the picture from Iran, women showing their hair now, with all the risk. This has to be used as a start of a revolution and not just an uprising. And I think that is the core also for us to take in and understand. And also, broadly, that is the parliament in Norway, or the Nordic countries through the world, also to take in the 10-point plan from NCRI. Because no one can argue against this 10-point plan. I mean, it has all the values that you cherish: free and democratic, non-nuclear, committed to gender equality, respectful of human rights and individual freedoms, abolishing the death penalty and Sharia law, granting autonomy to Iran's national minorities, aligned with international peace and stability. And in this crucial moment, we must recognize that there is an organized and democratic alternative to the current regime, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And that is what we have to work on. And also to understand that Tehran's fear of the NCRI is evident through its persistent demonization, that I and others also have to live with. I see this in Norway. We witness it firsthand, the extent of this campaign, whenever the NCRI is favorably mentioned in the media, or we also, when we set up meetings in the parliament, it is always met on social media and other areas with criticism, because they want, and the regime wants to make up this picture that makes it difficult for our parliamentarians to see the real strong resistance of Iran. Because it seems that it's fragmented. And you have voices that criticize the regime, but they're still playing on keeping it fragmented. So this is also one of the reasons that I am here. Because Iran... Because Iran stands at a tipping point. And we cannot hope that moderate elements within the regime can bring about change. That approach has failed, as has been mentioned many times. So we have to have a firm stance against the regime. And as has been mentioned, full implementation of existing sanctions, introduction of new targeted sanctions, cutting off the regime's financial lifelines. And even though, as former Minister of Climate and Environment, I do not support drill, baby drill, we do have to stop the finances within also through the oil exports that the regime is having. But sanctions are not enough. The international community must also recognize and engage with the true agents of change, the Iranian people, and their organized resistance. And that again, this is my first time here, but that again is what I need to work on, going back to Norway. Not to have the support that you mean from individual parliamentarians, but to have political parties showing a stronger support and building coalitions showing a stronger support. And I truly, and that is also the reason I now mention it, to me, I've been Minister of Climate and Environment, it's what I work with. I believe that the largest problems we have in front of us is global warming, is loss of nation, but it's also standing up for freedom and democracy. And to me, they're closely interlinked. And as dictators now support and cooperate with each other, we democracies and everyone believing in democracy and freedom have to stand together. That is in support of Ukraine, and it's in the struggle to have a free, democratic Iran. And that is the core. A free, democratic, and peaceful Iran is within reach. What just happened in Syria shows how fast change can come. And when, and it is when, we have a free, democratic Iran, that is, of course, tremendous achievement for all Iranians. But it will also bring tremendous change into the Middle East. And it's a huge achievement that will change the world for the better. So I will conclude that let us not relax before we have that situation where we can have meetings like this, not on discussing or supporting the resistance, but when we can have a meeting like this, discussing the future and how to develop and support a free, democratic Iran, and have that meeting in the beautiful, wonderful, fantastic Iran. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much from very distinguished guests and dear friends, especially after a very strong speech, your speech. I'm sure that Mullah's regime have reacted very soon about your speech and your presence, because they fear from this gathering from this strong speech, and they have to fear from this solidarity and this support. تشکر میکنم از همه خواهران و برادران عزیزمون در اشرف 3 که امروز با ما همراه بودین در این کنفرانس فوق‌العاده تو این شرایط فوق‌العاده. شما همه شاهد همه عواطف و احساسات و بعد همراهی و حمایت همه شخصیت‌ها و نمایندگان نسل‌های مختلف که اومدن اینجا و صحبت کردن و شاهدین. همه اینها بیان این است که راه شما، مسیر شما، فداکاری‌های شما، سازمان یافتگی شما و تشکیلات شما در این 60 سال این چنین در نقطه اوج و محصول و میوه هست. مطمئنم که رژیم بسیار 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 وحشت خواهد کرد و به زودی واکنش‌هایی رو خواهید دید. و یادتون باشه که امسال سال مسئولیت‌های سنگین هم برای همه شما هم برای همه اشرف نشان هاست. با درود بر همه شما. خدا نگهدار.
Mrs. Rajavi, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's been my profound personal pleasure and great privilege to serve as your Master of Ceremony this afternoon. Allow me to take this opportunity to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each of our incredibly eminent and distinguished and very eloquent speakers for their invaluable contributions here this afternoon, but also for their solidarity with the Iranian people and their struggle for a free and a democratic Iran. I would also like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your energy and for your passion this afternoon. We have all very much appreciated your enthusiasm throughout this afternoon's conference. The path to a brighter and future Iran begins, of course, with our collective commitment to upholding human rights and dignity. And therefore, in closing, I would like to thank each of you for your unwavering dedication, for your passion and your commitment to a free Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.